Hello, my name is Philip Plotch, and I'm the principal researcher here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars. Eno is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank that shapes public debate on multimodal transportation issues and builds a network of innovative transportation professionals. Today, we're discussing important lessons that we can learn from other countries about building rail projects. This week, Eno released an in-depth report titled On the Right Track, Rail Transit Project Delivery Around the World by Paul Lewis, Eno's policy director. I just have a few housekeeping issues before we begin. Paul is going to give a presentation, it's about 15 minutes long, and then we'll ask him some questions. In the question tab, you can type in your questions by clicking Ask New Question. We'll get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A. While we don't expect any technical issues, we've found that exiting and rejoining the webinar tends to help any minor issues that come up. Eno is happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. If you're interested in supporting our work, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. You can find slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org, enotrans.org. The recording will also be emailed to all the registrants within a day. And with that, here's Paul.
All right, thank you, Phil. And I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully that works. Okay. Again, thanks, Phil, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited that this week we released our newest paper called On the Right Track, Rail Transit Project Delivery Around the World. That's building on a lot of existing work that we've had. And so Phil said I had 15 minutes, it may be a little bit closer to 20. So bear with me as we go through the high-level review of this paper prior to our Q&A session. Just wanted to say it's important to note that this is part of our larger research program on project delivery. If you go to projectdelivery.enotrans.org, you can download this paper, and you can download the paper we released last year called Saving Time and Making Sense. We have our case study archive, which includes over 15 different case studies from countries or regions around the world on how they deliver projects. We had a project delivery symposium last fall that you can watch recordings from, and you can look at our project delivery resources, which includes our database and also some links to other important collaborators in the space, including some very helpful friends at New York University and the program that they've been doing there, looking at project delivery, University of California, Berkeley, and others that have been part of this discussion and really part of this broader effort to find ways to cut timelines and costs for transit projects around the world. This particular report, it builds on what we've been working on for a long time and has three main goals. The first is to compare project delivery among democratic countries. Our first report last year primarily focused on Western Europe and Canada. We thought it would be really helpful to expand around the world and look at other places that may have really important lessons beyond those. And so this accomplishes that goal. It is a high-level review, so we don't go into detail of specific projects, but we do look at how those countries are working to deliver their capital projects and what lessons we can draw from them. And it's important. It's going to be an important basis for future research, right? We found a few places where we want to dig a little bit deeper into the future, and for peer exchanges that I'm going to talk about in our recommendation section here in a few minutes. So here's a picture of a map, if you can see it, where we have our 10 case studies looking at Canada, Mexico, Chile, Norway, Germany, Italy, South Africa, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. In those 10 countries, we looked at 132 rail projects and added those to our database. And then for each one, we called up stakeholders at government, at agencies, at consultants, contractors, labor unions to get a better sense of how they deliver projects, looking at their government, their governance, and their legal structures, how they approach project planning and regulation, how they fund their projects, and what methods or strategies do they use to construct them. And so the details of all this is found in our in the case studies themselves, which again you can look at on our website. But I want to go over a couple high-level takeaways and kind of where things stand. If we look at the average cost per mile for primarily tunneled projects, this is where the United States is the worst in the world, at least the ones that we reviewed, at $1.3 billion per mile. These are in 2020 numbers, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for purchase price parity, and all the detail for this is found on our website and in our database. Paying several times more. If you take out the New York City projects, so the Second Avenue subway and the 7-line extension, the U.S. comes closer to $600 million per mile. So still the most expensive in the world, but maybe not quite as bad as it looks here. But then you look at the aspirational countries, South Korea, Italy, Chile, Norway, that build at a fraction of what we can. And so there's some really important lessons coming from those countries. Australia is not on here because Australia did not have any primarily tunneled projects over the past 20 years. We also looked at it from an at-grade basis, right? The United States builds a lot of at-grade projects, and this is where the U.S. is not necessarily the most expensive in the world. Japan actually has had some really expensive at-grade projects, although not very many of them, as same for Mexico. But again, some of the same countries that built tunnel transit really well also build at-grade transit really well. In this case, Germany, Chile, Italy, and Norway. You'll notice South Korea is not on this list because they did not build any projects that were primarily at-grade. So again, just trying to show some comparison to where the U.S. stands. There's a lot of nuance in here, and of course, it's not always an apples-to-apples comparison, but it does give an order of magnitude of where the U.S. stands and what level of emphasis we need to place on solving this problem. So again, I'm going to go into these the countries. Each one of them is probably its own webinar in and of itself, and we're hoping we might be able to do that here later this year. But I'm going to start by giving a very high-level overview of each one, some of the big takeaways, some of the things that we found particularly interesting or compelling about each country. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So if you're downloading on our website, again, projectdelivery.enotrans.org, you can look at the case studies as we go through them. The first we'll start with is Australia. Australia has built 10 or at least it has opened 10 projects in the past 20 years, and some are currently ongoing. 8 of them since 2014. So they've opened a lot of new transit, mostly at-grade projects in some of their biggest cities. One of the benefits that Australia has is that its major metro areas are completely contained within the state or territorial boundaries. And so they have the concentration of decision-making authority at the state level, which helps smooth out some of the jurisdictional issues that we find in some other places. The one thing I'll say about Australia is that anyone that follows project delivery broadly knows that Australia uses a lot of public-private partnerships. And public transit is no exception. And there's some really interesting examples of P3s that you should take a look at, either where a private consortia is designing, building, and operating, maintaining it over 15 plus years, or you have a private company that's design building it, and then they contract out the operations over a long term to another private company. So a lot of private sector involvement in Australia that is really interesting to take a look at. Next, we'll talk about Canada. Canada's opened 12 transit projects over the last 2 decades. The Canadian costs for subways are generally higher than many of the other democratic countries we looked at, but still a little bit lower than in the US. One of the interesting things about Canada is that environmental reviews are not conducted at the national or federal level. But each province has its own process and its own authorities for environmental review. And Ontario in particular, a lot of Canadians talked about how they've taken a pretty unique approach to developing a special process for public transit projects that helps streamline the reviews and provides a little bit of flexibility for them. The next country I want to talk about is Chile. Chile was probably one of the most impressive places we looked at, and perhaps the most successful example of low-cost transit building in the world. Lines that are 100% tunneled in Chile are average only $154 million per mile. They were the lowest in our database. And some of that is stemming from a pretty consistent pipeline of building. Over the past 20 years, Chile has built 60 miles of tunneled transit heavy rail in the capital city of Santiago. They built a 26-mile light rail line in Valparaiso. And when we talked to folks in Chile, there was a couple of factors that led to this. One, people touted that they have quite good soils for tunneling, so I think that certainly helps. But most importantly, they have really strong public sector institutions at Santiago Metro in particular, that have a lot of staff capacity and expertise and manage all of the project management and oversight components in-house. And then they also do something that we found in other places in the world, where they take the civil works and they divide it up into smaller segments, and they contract out those smaller segments rather than contracting out an entire transit line at once. They found that this is a little bit more complicated to manage, which goes back to my second point about having that really high quality public sector staff. But it invites competition from smaller construction firms, which helps bring down costs. It protects projects and insulates them from contractor-related disruption, and provides agencies with additional leverage over some of those construction firms. Moving on to Germany. Germany was a really interesting case. They've built a lot of rail, mostly at grade, but also a couple tunneled projects. They're one of the more expensive countries for building tunneled projects and one of the cheapest countries for building at grade projects. And we tried to figure out why that is. And I think there's a couple reasons. Most of their tunneled projects were pretty short. And so there's kind of some inherent built-in costs for some of those short projects. A lot of stakeholders had increasing concerns about delays, high costs, budget overruns, those kind of things. But we do think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from Germany and the at-grade transit projects, particularly useful to the United States because we build primarily at-grade light rail in this country. And so there's some helpful lessons, particularly in Germany's use of this transit alliances, which are kind of like regional coordination bodies. They really help with the coordination and the public buy-in components early on. They have an interesting structure. They have a targeted board makeup, and they have the right authorities to aligning the public transit operators from their capital program standpoint to provide value, particularly in the planning and early stages of the project where we often don't put enough emphasis. And so there's a lot we can learn from the transit alliances that are going on in Germany. All right, Italy is another really compelling country with pretty low costs. We've, again, thanks to a bunch of information we got from our friends at NYU that have been doing a lot of really detailed work in Italy. They built 21 new rail projects or extensions in the last 20 years. Tunnel projects are costing around $260 million per mile, and at-grade projects are about $56 million per mile, so significantly cheaper than averages in the United States. The thing that kind of stood out in Italy is they have really high-quality public institutions that help build and permit these projects. They've a lot of feedback we got about how project management staff are empowered to make quick decisions during constructions. Things are completed really quickly. One example of good coordination and trust in public sectors is on the archaeological front, right? Italian projects face a tremendous amount of archaeological difficulties given the historic nature of the country. And so they put a lot of archaeological mitigation into the upfront planning. And then when there are cases of unexpected relics or artifacts that are found along the way, there's a established trust between agencies and a way to expedite the mitigation in that sense without having significant delays on project costs or timelines. So this is a really important lesson from Italy. Moving on to Japan. Japan is an interesting case. They have one of the most extensive rail networks in the world. They've finished 18 new urban rail projects in the past 20 years. Construction costs in Japan tend to be a little higher than the 10-country average that we looked at. And some of that is due to some complex soils, pretty complex geographies, and some of the densest cities on the planet. And another factor that came up a lot in our interviews is that Japan places a tremendous premium on very high quality operations and operational reliability, which adds some upfront cost to making sure that those systems are in really, really good shape. And so that's a, anyone that's been to Japan knows that the system is incredibly punctual, and I think that they build a lot of that into their construction costs. All right, going down to Mexico. Mexico has built 9 transit projects, mostly concentrated around Mexico City since 2000. Transit construction in Mexico is a state-led effort with very little local input. The states tend to fully encompass most of the metro areas, Mexico City included, although Mexico City does expand into some of its, the metro area does expand in some of the nearby states. Mexico is able to build it at a slightly lower cost than the United States, but still was more expensive than we anticipated. And when we talk to folks there, some of this is stemming from the fact that there isn't a lot of local buy-in, and there isn't a lot of local participation at all with Mexican projects, which can slow things down when you get into the construction phase. And so some folks suggested that greater local involvement, even while maintaining state level control, could help, and also addressing some concerns about construction, corruption, and conflicts of interest could also be helpful. Okay, moving on to Norway. Norway was an interesting case because it's a small country. It's completed only 5 projects in the past decade, but has managed to build them at a tremendously low cost and significantly lower than most peers. And so it kind of flies in the face of some of the other lessons where having a really big established program is really critical to project success. And so they were able to do this without a lot of institutional capacity. There's a couple things that we found that contributed to this. And one of them is that the government in Norway is pretty open to its willingness to address governance and reform governance. There's been several big governance reforms in the regions, particularly around Oslo and Bergen, that have been helpful in aligning the institutional mission and goals with delivering projects and delivering high quality service. And so being proactive about governance has certainly paid off there. And then Norway also has some really compelling quality assurance reviews that are worth taking a look at. They're initiated by the national government. They're supported by independent consulting firms. And the process reviews things like technical design, evaluates political influence, brings accountability to projects, and has a really good assessment of risk. And so a lot of countries have that, but it seemed like the Norwegian example was really well done. South Africa, I think this is our penultimate case. South Africa has built 1 transit line in the past 20 years, the How Train, which is pictured here. It's a 50-mile quasi-commuter, quasi-regional rail system that connects Johannesburg to Pretoria and or Tambo Airport. It used a P3 model for this, a design, build, finance, operate, maintain, for a couple of reasons. That helped complete the funding package, which was helpful in this large project. It brought in external expertise that was non-existent in the country, or at least not in great quantities, and so they felt that was an important part. And it provided some stability for long-term operations of the system. And so the project was not among the cheapest in terms of a per mile basis, but there was a significant amount of tunneling and some really complex geography and soils between Johannesburg and Pretoria. And so it's definitely worth taking a look at that P3. All right, and then finally, we looked at South Korea. South Korea is another really impressive country when it comes to building transit. They've built over 100 miles of subway over the past 20 years and have established the country as a global leader in tunneled rail transit. They've not only been able to build 100 miles of transit, but they've built it at $255 million per mile. under dense urban areas with complex soils and geographies. It's really an incredible feat. One of the things that I think contributes to this, among lots of others, is that they tend to build pretty long projects, right? Instead of building short extensions, 11 of their 18 projects were 10 miles or longer. And you can see that in our database. They have these longer projects. And when we talked to folks there, they said that this could be in part because it brings efficiencies, especially when using things like tunnel boring machines, which are really important, really expensive to start and finish. Okay. So I just want to go through a few recommendations before we jump into the Q&A session. There are three here that I'm going to talk about governance, about coordination and empowerment of public sector managers, and investing and learning about international practices. And so the paper has a little bit more specificity on these, but at a high level, one of the things that we didn't find is there was no consistent ties between how a country is governed, what kind, whether it was centralized or decentralized, whether it had a parliamentary structure or a federalist structure. That didn't seem to matter. But what did matter was good project governance. And what do we mean by that? The first bullet point here is that the project sponsor in particular needs to have the right governance and board structure, the authorities, and the right public sector staff to lead a transit mega project. And that's going to be really, really critical to moving these complex projects forward. It's also important that these projects are led with public sector staff. Pretty much every country, and certainly the ones that had lower costs, used public sector staff for project management and oversight. They certainly did use consultants, but they were used for discrete tasks, and they were not in charge of project management tasks. The other thing that came up in a bunch of different countries, and Chile, I talked about this a few minutes ago, keeping construction contracts small can be really helpful. It's not always a solution, and there's some cases where it doesn't make sense, but it does seem to be best practice when possible to break a line up into a bunch of different components and contract them out separately to get some of that agency leverage and competition. P3s came up when they were warranted, right? And we saw some of that in Australia and in South Africa in particular. But again, the public sector project managers have to know how to manage that project if it's going to be successful. One of the other group of recommendations is talking about enhancing coordination and empowering public sector project managers. We talked about that a little bit in the last one, but it's super important. Frequent early stakeholder coordination is really, really critical. I think this is something that came up in a lot of different places. And if you look at the third bullet here, streamline environmental reviews is something that comes up a lot. A lot of countries struggle with environmental reviews, and there's a lot of effort to try to streamline that. But the thing that seems to be most effective is not necessarily changing the environmental review process, but doing more early stakeholder coordination, more planning, getting everyone on the same page before you went in the environmental review to make sure that the rest of the project goes smoothly. Empowering project managers to make key project decisions. So it's not just having public sector staff, but having them in a position where they can make decisions and move projects along. That's going to be really important. A lot of other countries have done efforts to streamline reviews, like we've done a bunch of things here in the United States over the past 20 years. There's always new ideas coming up, and so it's important to learn from other countries about what they've been working on in that sense. And then the last area is a perennial one for Eno, and something that we certainly mentioned in our first paper is investing in ongoing learning about international best practices. I think one of the best ways that we can change the dynamic here in the United States is to get out and go visit countries that make sense. Some of that we can learn about from Norway and other places of refining and formalizing assessment models, not just to evaluate projects and prioritize projects and plan projects, but also on the bidder side, so that we're not just chasing the lower cost bid and really going for top quality construction. participating in study tours, learning about best practices in other places. I think this is something that we're hoping this paper can help, right? If you're in California, you know that you live in an earthquake zone. And so looking at Japan and Chile may be of most interest, and maybe not as relevant looking at Paris and Copenhagen, for example. And if you're building a new build, you might want to look at Norway, because Norway didn't have a lot of experience, whereas Chile has a long-standing capital program. And so I think that the case studies really provide a basis for targeting those potential future study tours in the right direction. And then the last, increasing the public and political appeal of building transit is always something that helps. And that's something we can continue to work on here in this country. All right. So I have been talking for too long. I know and so I'm going to go to questions. You can see my email and my Twitter handle is here. So is Phil's, and so he's going to join me. And we're going to talk through a couple of questions. I know that there's a bunch been coming in on the question function, and we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So I'm going to turn off this PowerPoint. There we go. And there's Phil. And all right, so let's answer some questions.
Okay. First, thank you, Paul. Somebody wrote great presentation with 2 exclamation points, and I just want to confirm I agree with that one. So we have lots of questions here. Let me start with planning. Somebody was asking about the U.S. taking decades to finalize plans and complete their designs. Did you see that kind of problem in other countries also?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on the project, and one of the challenges with this, right? And we've talked to a lot of other people about it. Is when we talk about how long does it take to build something, the question is when does planning start, right? And planning can start when somebody puts a line on a map, 20 years ago, and then it eventually evolves into something. What we've tend to find is that when a project has really good appeal and a clear path to funding, the planning can actually move along relatively quickly. Now, we don't necessarily invest enough time into that planning to make sure that we have the agreements that we need, and we have the general basis for the project before moving into some of the environmental and other permitting phases. But planning is one of those things that is important, but also a little nebulous. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it does kind of make it difficult to know when planning really does start in earnest.
Right. So where do you think the change is most needed? Do you think it's at the federal level, the local level, the state level?
Yeah. So when we looked at this, we were expecting, when we started this project, that there would be, 4 or 5 big things we could do, but there's actually dozens of little things that I think amount to a meaningful difference. And some of those are targeted towards federal level, some of them at certain states, some of them at certain transit agencies, some of them at the private sector too. So there's recommendations for everybody. Where I think it would make the most difference is actually at the project sponsor level. So whether that's a transit agency or some kind of special purpose vehicle that's building a project, that's where the most attention needs to be and the most reform.
Okay. A couple of people were asking about the costs. So are these construction costs, and does it include design costs also?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most of them are construction costs. We tried to, when we could, pull out the cost of equipment, rail yard facilities, rolling stock, things that are kind of not directly related to the build. But yeah, they're supposed to be construction costs. And this is where it gets challenging. And we had some pushback from some of the folks on our advisory panel about these comparisons, because in some cases, things might include certain costs that aren't included in others. And the way that these costs are reported is not always super transparent. And so I think we have to take the cost numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I think they are important in kind of pointing out the order of magnitude scope of the issue we're talking about, and where we can target the reforms to bring some of those efficiencies.
Somebody asked whether the environmental laws in the United States and the labor requirements in the United States are adding a lot to the costs here.
Yeah, we didn't get into. We certainly talked about labor in every place, and in our first paper we talked a little bit about labor. And when I'm talking about labor, it's mostly that frontline construction workforce labor. Um, in most regions, they don't see labor as a major cost driver. Labor is certainly expensive, no question. But the folks what we talked to here in this country really didn't seem to say, yeah, there's really awful work rules and there's really, really high wages, right? And there's no way to kind of change federal law to soften that. So they didn't see that as an area ripe for reform. Again, it's an expensive component, but the reforms are not necessarily targeted at labor. The only exception to that was when we talked to folks in New York City, where there does seem to be a little bit more of an issue with work rules and in particular and overtime and those kind of things that are driving labor costs, but not generally in other places.
Okay, you mentioned about Japan, how you think that they build to a higher standard. Did you notice any difference between the U.S.? Like we're paying more, but are we getting something better out of it?
Yeah, this is actually something that I think is a little bit of a problem, and it's a chicken and an egg issue, right? Where we have high costs, and so transit agencies and project sponsors are under a lot of pressure to bring down costs. And so what we do is we build projects where not perhaps it makes sense for the riders, but where it can be cheaper. And if you look at a lot of rail transit projects in this country, a lot of them tend to be in freeway medians, and a lot of them tend to be in freight rail right-of-ways. And that might make sense in some cases, but generally that's because it's a lot easier. You're not disrupting communities and you're not taking a bunch of land if you're putting it in a highway median. But for anyone that's ridden on those services, you know that it's not necessarily the best land use around the stations, and they're not particularly easy to get to, and they're not as pleasant as if there was a station in the middle of a dense urban boulevard. And so you don't see that as much in other countries. You don't see other countries building transit in the middle of freeways in the same way that we do. And I think that the fact that we have high costs leads us in that direction.
When you mentioned the Japanese standard, did it come up in the tracks? Did it come up in the electronics? Do you know what components added to the cost in Japan?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we didn't get into that level of specificity, but it's definitely something that I'd like to dive a little bit more into, right? And I think that it would be also helpful to make some comparisons to other countries, right? I think in South Korea they have similar operational standards and efficiencies, and South Korea is quite a bit cheaper than what we saw in Japan, and so maybe that's because Japan is only building out some of its more complicated segments now that it has a really mature network. But I think that that's definitely worth looking into in future work.
Somebody asked about the cost differential between Melbourne and Sydney, which is sort of a more general question. I'll ask you, did you see a cost differential within countries?
In some cases, yeah. I mean, you'll look at different regions and you say, why is it so much more expensive in this region? And the United States is one of those, right? New York is head and shoulders above everyone else, and then you have some regions that do it pretty cheaply, and some regions that are a little bit more expensive. And so part of that is it's hard to make a direct conclusion without getting into project details, because they can often be apples to apples, right? Different cities have different soils, different cities have different geographic structures, different demands for their transit system. And so without getting into that level, it's hard to say that a particular city has a huge cost issue over another city, unless you really dive into those details of the specific projects.
Yeah. So Paul, we're not trying to stump you here, but here's a great question. Since the FTA is helping fund the research, how do you think they could use the information in working with project sponsors to maximize federal grants?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the FTA has been a great partner in this work, and they've given us the resources to do a lot of this work and have a lot of autonomy in how we put it out. Part of our process has been talking to folks around the world and in the United States about project delivery. And a lot of people are very complimentary of the help and assistance that FTA gives transit projects, right? And a lot of these agencies don't deliver big projects on a regular basis. And so they rely a lot on the project oversight, the CIG process, and the staff at the regional offices to help deliver these projects as effectively as possible. And the one thing, right? There's lots of things that we can talk about, and I'll mention a few things. But one thing that comes up a lot is just more staff, right? One of the differences you see, Federal Highway Administration has regional offices in every state capital, right across the street from the state DOT, whereas Federal Transit Administration has a dozen or so regional offices that are kind of scattered around the country. For example, when you're building the Silver Line in Virginia, the regional office is in Philadelphia. And so you don't necessarily have as closeness of staff and as much resources to help with these big projects. And I think that's one thing that we've talked about over the course of this program is improving that resource. And then, one of the works that you'll be, one of our forthcoming research projects is looking at the project management workforce and finding ways to have the FTA and other trade groups involved in developing better project managers in the public sector. We're training them, attracting them to the workforce is going to be really important in the future.
So, Paul, if we could give you a magic wand, and if there was one change you could make here in the United States, what do you think it would be?
So we get that a lot, and you talked at the beginning. What were some of them that the recommendations that really stood out, and there's really dozens that need to happen. If I'm not sure if I could pick just one, but there are a few I think that really stand out, and one of them is that governance piece, right? Getting the right institutions and the right staff to lead these projects, right, is really, really critical. And it's something I think that we don't spend enough time thinking about and working on in this country. And so that governance piece is really such an important part of this. The other is workforce, and we mentioned labor. And if we have a workforce problem in this country, it's not resting with the frontline workforce. It's actually with the public sector folks that are leading these projects that don't necessarily have the capacity, the staffing power, the expertise to lead these big projects. And that's no criticism of them. They're just kind of it's a product of the institutions that we have. And so investing in that workforce is going to be a really critical way to addressing some of the systemic cost problems. And then something that I always say is just learning from other countries, right? Reading case studies, going to visit places, learning about how they do things. If you're a city and you're building a first transit project, or you haven't built one in a while, there are hundreds of cities around the world that are doing this, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we build a transit project. And so learning from best practices is just going to be so critical, and leveraging experiences from other countries that have similarities to your region is really important.
So, Paul, if anyone's planning their summer vacation now, I would suggest they go to Seoul to check out the transit system and check out the new lines and how extensive and wonderful it is. Any suggestions for people where they should go see and to sort of be surprised by some of the building and construction that's going on?
Yeah, Phil is saying that because he spent a couple of years in Seoul prior to joining Eno. He was there and I think really absorbed. And some of the pictures in our report are from him. So you should definitely take a look at that. Seoul is really an incredible story and definitely worth exploring. We were particularly impressed with Chile. They've got some really good methods and really amazing outcomes, things that they've done over the past 20 years. Norway was also a really impressive country. Italy and Germany, particularly Germany's trams, again, really, really amazing projects at pretty low cost. And so those are definitely countries I would prioritize. But, anytime you can get out and talk to other people is going to be really helpful.
Yeah. Somebody asked whether if we had national design standards for light rail, if those kinds of standards would help us bring down costs. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a problem with customization in the U.S. and it's pretty pervasive. I was actually just talking with somebody about the customization of buses, right? And anyone that works in bus procurement knows that there's a tremendous amount of customization that goes in that makes every bus procurement completely different than the next one. And I think that standard the customization also applies to a lot of rail projects. And it's hard to say that there should be a national standard because there's so many different components for light rail, right? And there's a lot of existing systems. A lot of projects that we do are extensions of existing systems. And so in some cases, we've kind of already bought into a specific design or system that makes it challenging, right? But if you're starting a project from scratch, getting off-the-shelf designs, off-the-shelf vehicles, off-the-shelf technology, you're going to save a lot of money. And resisting the temptation to over-customize things is going to be really, really important. And that's something that we've seen in many other cases, is that the interoperability and the standardization, copying other people's designs, it's a form of flattery, right? And you want to use that as much as you can.
Yeah. Have you seen where countries are learning from each other? Let's say the EU countries are learning better ways of doing it, and then they're incorporating that into their practices?
Yeah, it's actually one of the things that came up a bunch of times in interviews with folks in South Korea, is that they built their transit system primarily over the past 20 or 30 years, and they very heavily leveraged expertise from Japan. Japan at that point had mostly built out its subway system and was doing much more small kind of extension projects, and so they could leverage Japanese expertise. And I think that was helpful in the beginning. And then once they developed and established that know-how in-house in that country, then they've become experts in their own right, right? And so I think that's definitely been a really interesting lesson.
So a couple of people asked about operations and maintenance, and you can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So first, are we building things and they're more expensive, but they're less to maintain and less to operate, or is actually the opposite, that it's more to maintain and more to operate?
That's a really good question, and we didn't go into kind of that life cycle operations and maintenance component, and so I don't know if I have a good answer to that particular question, but I think that that's something that we can kind of build into that upfront process, making sure that we're building assets that last, that are going to be easy to maintain, that are going to be cost effective, right? And this is where a lot of countries are building automated lines, right, that have off-the-shelf automated train technology, that have platform doors, right, that these things are built in from the start, so that we don't have to retrofit, we don't have to spend decades trying to do things like automation, when we can do it right from the very beginning.
Okay. Somebody else asked about foreign companies. Apparently there's large construction companies that work in other countries that have trouble entering the United States market. Do you know anything about that at all?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the construction market is that it tends to start local, right? And I'm going to go back and change papers to our last study that looked at Madrid, right? And Madrid had one of the most impressive subway building campaigns in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they built a tremendous amount of rail at pretty low cost. And when they started that endeavor, they didn't have a lot of expertise in the private sector. But by doing a lot of it, and by having smaller contracts, and the same thing's happening right now in Chile, they created a whole industry. And many of the international construction firms that are out there right now are from places like Chile or France or Madrid, that started as one of these smaller contractors in one of these projects, and then built the expertise and built the company from there. I think one of the things that I'd like to see more of in this country is some of those smaller contracts, or breaking lines up into more manageable segments, which does require a lot more management effort on the public sector, no question. But it invites more competition. It's not like there's one multi-billion-dollar line that only one consortia is going to win. With a smaller contract, with smaller civil contracts, you can have more of that competition and perhaps get a foothold and invite more competition.
Okay. Great, Paul. We're running out of time. So I just wanted to say thanks again. And can you just remind everybody, if they want to learn more about this topic, if they have questions about this topic, where they could go?
Yeah, so certainly visit our website, projectdelivery.enotrans.org. You can download this paper. You can download our other papers, our case studies, our database. There's links to some of our partner organizations. And so there's a lot that you can do on the website. But certainly, reach out to me, reach out to Phil. Phil has a tremendous amount of expertise in this field as well. And so staff here at Eno are interested in engaging on this subject at the local level, at the national level, at the state level. And if we don't know the answer, the great thing is that we've got a really cool network that we can connect you with to make sure that we get your question answered.
Great. So thanks, Paul, for answering all those tough questions. We really appreciated it. And thanks to everybody here for participating in today's webinar. You can find slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org. And the recording will be emailed to everybody who registered. Make sure to sign up for our mailing list to gain access to Eno's newsletter, to our webinar announcements, to report releases, and more. We're happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. If you enjoy them, check out the link in the chat box about donating or becoming a member. And make sure to sign up for our next webinar on October 4th. We're going to have a great panel from the trucking, railroad, and the port sectors. They're going to be talking about the role of technology in modernizing supply chains. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.